Insulin, I would contend, is the most powerful hormone in metabolism. It is directly elevated in response to blood sugar elevations, and when released, has a profound impact on various tissues.
As someone that studies insulin, essentially day and night, I mean, this is what you do. People associate insulin with body composition, fat accumulation, fat loss, yada, yada. Those things are important. We can talk about those. But how important is insulin and low insulin versus moderate insulin, even for a regular person, people with conditions? How important is that for just metabolic health, metabolic function, and just general health?
That's a great question. And yes, I study insulin and its consequences, but I also live this as well on a personal basis. Insulin has a lot of consequences in the context of metabolism. We know that high levels of insulin, especially in the peripheral vasculature, tissues, vascular here, maybe less central around your organs and other tissues, is associated with something called insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is associated with many, some would argue all, of the metabolic diseases we commonly think about. Particularly, the hallmark is type 2 diabetes. But from a physiologic perspective, insulin, I would contend, is the most powerful hormone in metabolism. It is directly elevated in response to blood sugar elevations, and when released, has a profound impact on various tissues. So one of the most important tissues is the liver. The liver controls key functions of, let's say, pathways such as fat oxidation, ketogenesis. At the fat tissue, insulin can shut down something called lipolysis, the breakdown of actual fat tissue to be mobilized and used for energy. Insulin has powerful effects on anabolism of muscle. So with sufficient levels of protein present, insulin can actually help facilitate the propagation of muscle protein synthesis or the prolongation of it, at least to a certain degree. Although protein appears to play the predominant role there, insulin can obviously play a permissive role in muscle metabolism and growth. But it is, in the most basic terms, a incredibly powerful, the most powerful anabolic agent the body produces. And there are incredible insights that can be gained on various tissues when it is completely absent. And that is something we've learned from other fields of science, such as neuroscience, where the whole field of neuroscience really started from seeing parts of the brain being destroyed or perturbed. You could learn how parts of the brain worked. And we have learned more about insulin, in my opinion, from environments where it's completely absent.
So, talking conditions like maybe type 1 diabetes.
After today's video, I put a link down below for LMNT electrolytes. And now, in case you haven't seen it, they have their sparkling electrolytes, like an actual can, a ready-to-drink can of electrolytes in a sparkling fashion. So it tastes like a soda, but you're getting the electrolyte effect. So if you're in a caloric deficit, you're trying to cut, or you're trying to build muscle but stay lean at the same time, these things are amazing because you can sip on them during your workout and it feels like you're sipping on a soda, but you can also sip on it throughout the day and it just tastes really good. But they still have the same 1,000 milligrams sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium. Totally fasting friendly. They won't break a fast. You could have them before your fasted workout. They also have their regular packs, which of course I still use all the time. Like that's my baseline. But anyway, that link down below gets you a free variety pack with any purchase. So free variety pack. All you got to do is make a purchase and you get a sample variety pack with each flavor. So you got like a citrus salt, which is like lemon lime. You've got a watermelon salt. You've got a grapefruit salt, all these really good flavors. So that link, go to drinklmnt.com/Thomas, drinklmnt.com/Thomas, and it's in the top line of this description. Make sure you check out their sparkling flavors.
So yeah, in the context of type 1 diabetes, is a disease I have. So it's very personal to me. What happens when no insulin's present? Let's start there. When there's a complete absence of insulin at all, your body will not have the ability to control these key processes that we talked about, these enzymatic processes like fat oxidation, ketogenesis, lipolysis. As a result, you see rapid elevations in ketone levels, fat oxidation, and breakdown of fat tissue to pathological levels. levels too fast for the body to keep up with, and as a result, just the hydrogen ions that are attached to ketone bodies can saturate the blood at such high levels that can change pH and be life-threatening. And so we know that complete absence of insulin is life-threatening. The overabundance of insulin can also be pathological and drive diseases like type 2 diabetes and be underlying foundational part of the pathology of progression of a number of metabolic diseases. So,
this is I want to make sure. Speaking of which.
This is type 1 diabetes speaking to me. So right now, my blood sugar says that it is 70 milligrams per deciliter. So that's when the alarm goes off. And what happens is, in the context of type 1 diabetes, an overabundance of insulin can actually drive blood glucose to lower. And so what I do when that happens, even though it's coming down and stabilizing, even if it reaches a threshold of 70 milligrams per deciliter, which is a threshold of hypoglycemia, you ideally would want to take something like glucose, which I carry around with me all the time with this disease, to help bring glucose back up and maintain it in the normal range. And there's few mechanisms present in the body to help counter-regulate low glucose levels or low enough glucose levels to cause brain energy deficit and the counter-regulatory neuroendocrine response. And so there's a lot that can be learned from this disease around not just insulin pathology, but also glucose impacts on health.
I think it's really important for viewers and listeners to know that just because you're a type 1 diabetic doesn't mean that this information is not applicable. As a matter of fact, it makes the information more applicable, and we learn a lot. Like what you're essentially saying is we learn so much in what happens in the absence of insulin. And I have a question. So if someone that is type 1 diabetic, like what would happen to your body composition if you had never known that you were type 1 diabetic? And honestly, obviously could have died, but what would happen? What's the default? Like a lot of times people, it's sort of the opposite of what can happen sometimes with type 2 diabetes. But then I kind of want to go into that a little bit too. Like, would you just, because you don't have the anabolic hormone, would you just kind of waste away? What's going on there?
So you can actually look at examples prior to the discovery of insulin of kids who would, frankly, their body was doing just that. It was wasting away. So their fat tissue, their muscle tissue would all just completely catabolize because insulin is what shuts down that catabolic process. That's why it's such a powerful fat storage hormone. Most people, and probably most people on your channel, think, okay, insulin, it drives fat accumulation and can make me, gain weight and become fat. And that's true, but it's all about the balancing act, right? So the complete absence of it is pathological and can be deadly within hours to days. The overabundance of it can drive pathological disease over a period of years. And so it's really the key aspect of balancing that. And a lot of people focus on, kids before the discovery of insulin. Insulin was discovered in the early 1920s. It was one of the biggest discoveries just in medicine. It led to a Nobel Prize. And insulin, it actually in itself was associated with, I think, 3 or 4 different Nobel Prizes. And so it's very important. It has a very important impact. But yes, if I don't take insulin right now, or like on the back of my arm, I have an insulin pump right here that administers insulin over time. That's actually what, in part, that alarm is the detection of changes in glucose levels to a certain threshold. And then insulin will, I have a system that automatically will regulate levels of insulin. So it gives you a lot of insight with 24-hour glucose and 24-hour insulin over time. And in an absence of complete insulin, muscle and fat tissue just completely waste away. This is important to recognize because a lot of people think about, okay, well, if I do a ketogenic diet or if I fast, insulin's going, quote, to zero. That's false. Insulin's actually just going to much lower levels, but it's high enough to prevent complete dysregulation of metabolism, i.e. it would regulate and keep in control ketone levels. It regulates the amount of fat that's being oxidized. It helps stay low enough but not too high to allow for glucose metabolism to be sufficient. You can't have zero amounts of insulin. And that's what you can learn from diseases such as type 1 diabetes. And the research term I like to give patients with type 1 diabetes is an insulin knockout model. So they use these experimental models where they'll take, certain animal models in a laboratory setting and completely manipulate and knock out complete systems. And one of those systems can be insulin. You can learn tremendous amounts from completely knocking out a pathway or a molecule. And in the context of type 1 diabetes, those who are diagnosed with it are walking insulin knockout models. And not only can we learn a lot about the impact of insulin from its absence in the context of type 1 diabetes, but we also can learn a lot about its abundance in type 1 diabetes and its potential role in physiology. So in type 1 diabetes, you are injecting the insulin peripherally. So people who are watching this video can see this pump on the back of my arm. It's actually has a certain amount of insulin contained in here. And when blood sugar starts to elevate, it will automatically release insulin. Or, in people who don't use these pumps, they inject it. So they take, vials of insulin, inject it into their tissue, whether it be fat tissue or muscle tissue. But because it's artificially administered through peripheral tissues, the overwhelming amount of insulin is actually going to directly enter the peripheral vasculature. And this is very similar to type 2 diabetes, where people with type 1 diabetes historically were normal or under body weight, had normal lipids, didn't have this excess amount of adiposity. They didn't have excess levels of metabolites floating around in the blood, except for glucose. But they developed the same level of insulin resistance as people with type 2 diabetes. So what this then taught us was it was actually the peripheral elevation of insulin that in and of itself can drive insulin resistance as well. When you don't have all these other factors controlled, you just elevate the level of insulin in the vasculature, as the case in type 1 diabetes. You see similar levels of insulin in people with type 1 as type 2. And when you actually do advanced insulin clamp models of insulin sensitivity, you've seen the same levels of insulin insensitivity or insulin resistance, despite not having the excess body weight that people with type 2 diabetes often have.
So it's essentially telling you that hyperinsulinemia, just the chronic sort of circulation of it, is ultimately the problem.
It's not only a big problem, but you're also learning a lot about where the insulin is and the impact it has. So if you eat, a loaf of bread, right, and it elevates glucose levels and your body releases insulin, a lot of that insulin is initially going to the liver. It is estimated that about 3/4 of that insulin is immediately gobbled up by the liver and takes that glucose and binds it into, or causes insulin binding, causes the glucose levels to enter and then ultimately be stored as glycogen. And that's potentially life-saving in low glucose environments because the liver releases insulin to maintain blood glucose homeostasis and ultimately life. In the absence of blood glucose levels in the homeostatic range, you could die if they get too low. If they get too high, it can lead to pathological damage on various tissues rapidly, including the vasculature, the heart, and the brain. And so both the absence of insulin, the abundance of insulin, but also what we can learn about being able to control levels of insulin in type 1 diabetes, and then seeing variable levels of glucose. We can learn a lot about the impacts, not just of insulin, but also the direct impacts of glucose.
So I want to pivot for just a second and go kind of to administration of insulin. And if you were to take a bolus of insulin and you were to also eat a bunch of fat, would you store that fat? And I think what I'm kind of alluding to is, like, insulin is a storage hormone. So independent even of calories, in that moment, can insulin drive in the storage of fat as well?
This is a very interesting question with a lot of nuance. And I would argue it's about the relative amount. Okay. So it takes very little insulin to shut down processes of liver or glucose release. So the breakdown of glucose from glycogen into elevating levels of circulating glucose. What that's telling us is that insulin has a profound impact to the liver at shutting down or changing enzymatic processes within the liver. What about in the fat? Because that's really what you're talking about here. It takes a much higher level of insulin in these other tissues to change enzymatic processes. So it's about the relative dose that matters here. And that's important to highlight, because it doesn't mean that just because you have insulin in general that you're going to anabolically store levels of you're going to have excess levels of fat storage. I can promise you, if an individual is eating 2,000 calories right now and they eat fat and inject insulin, because you do have to inject insulin as a person with type 1 diabetes with fat, you will lose a ton of weight. because it's not just about the single administration of that insulin in that moment, which may blunt some of these catabolic processes. It is the accumulative effect over 24 hours and then subsequent days and days and days of insulin and then ultimately glucose. So it's the combination of the totality, not just a single moment in a single meal. But yes, in a single meal, if you administer insulin, you are going to change enzymatic processes for an acute window of time. But that acute window of time is the postprandial window, which is not 24 hours. So it's what's happening over the 24 hours, the cumulative effect of that matters.
So if someone is metabolically healthy and they have very clear, defined insulin spikes, I mean, a good example is like a bodybuilder, right, where they are essentially wanting to spike their insulin along with protein consumption and things like that. They're always trying to, whether it's right or wrong, it's just what we've seen, right? The old bodybuilding days, where like maybe the cumulative effect isn't necessarily hyperinsulinemia, but you're having pretty acute spikes that are going pretty high, and maybe not high relatively speaking to a type 1 diabetic or something, but decent spikes every few hours. But in between those meals, there's very adequate time for insulin to come back down. Yep. And I'm just curious your take on that, because it's something that I've talked about frequently. I refer to it as the valley, like when it comes to fat loss, and like focus on don't be so hung up if you're healthy on demonizing insulin. Focus a little bit more on maybe the time between meals for that insulin to come back down.
Yeah. So it's almost like a term I use is sinusoidal curve. So this almost like this up and down. It's not a linear line all day, at a set level. It is a rise and valley that occurs. And that's actually a common process in many aspects of our physiology and biology. Through circadian rhythms, you see these ups and downs that occur naturally. And that's the same with insulin. Insulin goes through highs and lows, valleys throughout the day and in response to food. And that is completely normal in most circumstances for the most part. There are obvious exceptions to that rule. But yes, when you have these high levels of insulin, you're changing enzymatic processes to facilitate storage and shut down certain processes like fat breakdown, liver release of glucose levels into circulation, and really facilitating storage. The amount of insulin does matter because the more you have, the more you will store. In these valleys, it allows for the body to not want to say undo that process, but lower insulin sufficiently to kind of counteract that process. So you don't want to be in a storage process all day, right? You don't want to store fat 24/7 or attempt to elevate protein synthesis 24/7. If that was the case, if insulin drove anabolism of the muscle 24/7 just by elevated levels, people with type 2 diabetes would be the most jacked people on earth. And it's just not what happens, right? There is pathology associated with just chronically excess amounts of insulin. It is about having both the peaks to drive certain processes, but also the valleys that are essential really to allow for this to have normal function. Where in the context of type 2 diabetes, it's chronically elevated. You might have some spikes within this chronic elevation, but the chronic elevation really disrupts the physiology. So it's a common theme in us as humans and in physiology and biology in general to have both peaks and valleys that are essential to allow for the peak to have its important role in things like muscle protein synthesis and fat storage, or stopping processes of just allowing for elevated levels of ketone bodies to unbridled levels, which in the context of diabetes is called diabetic ketoacidosis. But then in the low levels, it allows for certain liberating processes, the breakdown of fat, the allowance of liver to release more glucose. I mean, these are normal biological processes of highs and lows. And if you don't have those highs and lows, you actually see a lot of pathological perturbances associated with that.
This is an interesting question that you may not have an answer to. I don't even know if there's literature on this, but I know that growth hormone and insulin are very tied together, very closely tied together.
Yep.
If you administer exogenous growth hormone, like it's why bodybuilders a lot of times will utilize growth hormone and insulin, right? Because they kind of have a sort of a circadian relationship, if I'm not mistaken. But I guess my question is, in a type 1 and even a type 2 diabetic, like when you are having to manually control insulin, or in the case of a type 2 where it's just possibly chronically elevated, is there literature on how this affects growth hormone pulses?
So actually in diseases like type 1 diabetes, it appears that yes, they still have growth hormone elevation. But what's interesting is that there's some disruption in some of these hormonal processes, although a lot of that might be not just insulin that's doing this. It might also be associated with dysglycemia. So like some of the common hormones that are ascribed with, take the highlight in metabolism, particularly in the bodybuilding world, is things like insulin, things like growth hormone, things like IGF or insulin growth factor 1. And one example is actually the disruption of, because IGF is associated with drives anabolism in the muscle pretty profoundly. It also is associated with growth of things like in childhood of bone growth. So it's a very, very anabolic hormone, but insulin's role and IGF's role, both being insulin-like or insulin in and of itself, have kind of distinct effects. And there's been some interesting work in rodents that actually looked at knocking out insulin at certain tissues and seeing that IGF actually has a more profound impact on metabolism of certain tissues, particularly muscle. But things like dysglycemia, not necessarily insulin, can actually perturb not necessarily IGF levels, but actually perturb the ability for IGF binding protein, which plays a key role in regulating IGF, can disrupt it. And this has been highlighted as a potential associative mechanism by why kids with type 1 diabetes who have sufficient peripheral insulin and sufficient calories, but dysglycemia can actually have impaired growth. In fact, impaired growth is actually seen in type 1 diabetes. And this actually highlights another thing that can be learned out of a disease like this, where you don't have insulin or have variable and high glucose levels, that you can actually start associating relationships between things like glucose and certain key tissue developments. And in this case, it can actually disrupt bone growth. So yes, it does. Insulin plays a key role in kind of antagonism to growth hormone. Usually that's most prominent at night when growth hormone seems to spike. Insulin would typically be the lowest. But it also perturbs or changes other hormones like IGF binding protein. But insulin's not playing the role there as much, it appears. It appears that dysglycemia is playing a more predominant role in the regulation of that anabolic hormone.
So in short, I mean, is it, for a type 2 diabetic, is it likely harder for them to build muscle?
There is anabolic dysregulation that would be assumed to perturb the possibility of mounting the as much of an anabolic response. But that's hypothetical in theory. And
it shouldn't deter people from trying to.
No, in fact, exercise is one of the most powerful ways to increase insulin sensitivity in type 2 diabetes. There's a number of studies that show that exercise can increase insulin sensitivity within the day and sometimes up to 2 days in people with type 2 diabetes. And so it's incredibly important to exercise. Don't be perturbed to exercise with type 2 diabetes. That's incredible. Frankly, everyone should be exercising for health reasons, but particularly in type 2, they should frankly be doing it more than most people because of how powerful it can be. But also a side note on exercise in type 2, the effects appear to be short-lived. And so you have to maintain, at least on insulin sensitivity, so you have to maintain consistent exercise patterns to maintain the consistent benefit around insulin. So it's something you should certainly engage with if you have type 2 diabetes, at least highly recommended.
What about the role of insulin and visceral fat accumulation? Does, obviously being a storage hormone and being that like a good percentage of the insulin goes to the liver, visceral fat kind of being a proxy for liver fat, like is there someone that is insulin resistant, are they going to be at higher risk for developing visceral fat? And it's talking about type 2, and then we'll go to type 1.
Yeah, interesting question there. And to be honest, I don't know as much about the role of visceral fat, particularly in type 1 diabetes, and how peripheral insulin administration may drive or not drive that. So I don't actually know the answer to that question directly, but I will state that we see changes around things like, well, I guess I'll just say I don't know. I don't know how insulin would, in this case, drive visceral fat in the context of type 1. I know that many diseases are associated with elevated visceral fat is obviously not a good thing in general. It's been associated with negative outcomes. But you brought up fat accumulation in the liver, so fatty liver disease, which is not called fatty liver disease anymore. It's called MASLD, so metabolically associated steatotic liver disease. It's kind of a destigmatization of the term fatty liver, So it's been retermed this in 2024.
Couldn't they come up with something simpler than that?
No, that's not possible with scientists. No, it's not an option. Fatty liver, it described it as literally it is. It's fat laying in the liver, but they made it very complicated for sure.
Moderately overweight liver syndrome.
Yeah, I actually know some people who were part of the panel who did that, but they felt great about the term. But it's interesting. Sometimes there's a disconnect between how it was in the science world and how they like to describe things, and it's technical terminology with what people actually will understand. But insulin, one of the things that's interesting in type 1 diabetes is a much lower incidence of liver fat accumulation, or the incidence of what used to be called NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but now called MASLD. And I talked to some experts about this who were world experts in liver disease, non-alcoholic fat accumulation in the liver. And I said, do you think the reason for the very low incidence of fatty liver disease or MASLD in type 1 diabetes is completely driven by this low access of liver, because you're injecting in the periphery, and the overwhelming majority that stays in the periphery and not much gets to the liver? Do you think that that's driving the extremely low incidence of liver disease? And the overwhelming answer was, of course. Less insulin at the liver would very clearly be associated with less liver fat accumulation. At least that's how they felt about it. And it is true that there's a much lower relative incidence of fatty liver disease, MASLD, whatever you want to call it, in people with type 1 diabetes. And that, again, lends insights to, in the context of type 1 diabetes. Yeah, no worries. This lends insights into where insulin is and what that we can learn from not producing anymore, and how it's administered, and where it actually is in the body and its relevance to overall health. So that also is an interesting concept as well in athletic context. So a lot of people with type 1 diabetes may appreciate that if you have excess amounts of peripheral insulin, but less in the liver.
Man, I'm sorry, I'm joking.
So in the athletic context, when you have less insulin in the liver, but proportionally more in the muscle, there's, in theory, an opportunistic window to potentially shuttle more insulin and glucose into muscle tissue and less of the liver. And so that's an open area of interest, particularly for athletes who may want to have, either shuttling of water or glucose into the muscle for any particular reason. So yeah, it lends a lot of insights. And in some cases, having the complete disruption of insulin and having to completely control it on your own, complete disruption of glucose, and having to completely manually automate it now. So you're manually automating your glucose control. It's a lot of work. It's a 24/7 job, but what it gives you is profound insights into the 24/7 regulation of both glucose and insulin, its consequences on overall health over the long term, but also lends insights into the acute effects of changes in glucose. And the one powerful example I often like to give people is, there's always pushback against continuous glucose monitors. Like, why do we need these things on people? And as someone with type 1, and often this pushback is from the type 1 diabetes community, which I think is very odd. CGMs were originally developed in type 1 diabetes, and that was, how it started, what it was for, and that's how it got eventually to the normal health community, because we learned of all the consequences glucose could have originally in type 1 diabetes in order to inform why it might matter for people without it. And one prime example of that is that often people have talked about this idea of the post-lunch lull. They have a lunch and they feel like they want to take a nap afterwards. Well, go stick a CGM on and see what happens to your glucose levels. The one missed opportunity in people without type 1 diabetes is that you might see this elevation in glucose and this drop, and you might feel the fatigue or the lull, so to speak. You want to take a nap when the glucose comes down. But what you're missing in that window is what is assumed underlying that, which is this spike in insulin that happens as well. And we know that insulin doesn't just have effects on fat tissue or liver tissue and drives fat accumulation, anabolism in the body. It also has direct effects in the brain on various tissues that also have central regulatory effects. And one of those effects, of course, is often this neurological effect of insulin that is in concert with the elevation in glucose and the drop in glucose. And so it's very common to see this in type 1 diabetes because you're monitoring insulin 24/7. You're manually manipulating it all the time. Whereas outside of type 1 diabetes, you don't have that 24/7 monitoring unless you go get a CGM. And you might not have the opportunity to see insulin 24/7 unless you're literally in a clinic, paying for extremely expensive chronic serial insulin measures. So one day, I'm sure someone will make quite close to $1 billion if they ever get a continuous insulin monitor. That would be having the ability for the person in the normal population to not just see glucose, but also see insulin, something that people with type 1 diabetes have had the ability to see since insulin was administered, because you can quantify the amount administered, but since glucose was also discovered, or at least continuous glucose monitors were. And it can really teach you a lot and start associating things like how you feel. We know that changes in glucose levels, both its elevation and its general flux, so change, variability, can drive changes in symptoms of how you feel. Like high blood glucose levels and variable glucose levels are associated with physical and mental health symptoms. And just Google hyperglycemia. Normal glycemia is 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. For those in the millimolar numbers, we're looking at 3.9 to around 5.5, 6.5 millimolar. Within that range, that's called normal glycemia. Glucose levels above that range, you can start associating that with many symptoms around how you feel in the moment. So if I were to go low right now, Tom, I went down to 70, but luckily it's stabilized there. But if I were to have chronically continue to go down, you would see this. You would see a change in my cognition. You would see my inability to articulate words. You'd see all these changes in just the absence of energy within the brain. Unless you have a robust amount of ketones being produced, which I have like a circulating level around 0.3 to 0.7 in any particular day, then you're not compensating for that. Lactate can also compensate for lack of glucose, but again, glucose is the predominant one. And you don't have counter-regulatory mechanisms for things like lactate or ketone levels for them being too low. What you have is counter-regulatory mechanisms in the brain that drive massive hormonal changes, neurological changes when glucose gets too low, showing how important it is for survival. And people know this all too well with type 1 diabetes if they experience hypoglycemia. It's unfortunately quite common due to just the difficulty in managing exogenous insulin around food, food being the most powerful regulator of glucose control in the context of that disease. But it also lends a tremendous amount of insights to what other people can learn from what has been learned in this disease as well.
Yeah, you're literally a walking model to be able to test these things at different times. And I guess kind of the last question I have on this is, have you ever just for giggles, like messed around with insulin timing to try to build muscle, try things like that? I'm just curious, like kind of how, not suggesting that people go do that,
right, but
just to highlight sort of the importance or lack thereof of like timing insulin with post-workout or things like that.
So this gets more into the personal experience category, where I have found that, there's some evidence that shows that an insulin spike associated with like things like carbohydrate consumption can help facilitate augmentation of glycogen storage or resynthesis in the context of exercise, augment or increase muscle protein synthesis. But what about in the context of type 1 diabetes? I will tell you that it is my experience that, having insulin post, a workout, not necessarily through rapid acting carbohydrates, that's actually a really bad idea in type 1 diabetes for a lot of reasons. Peripheral insulin administration is so much slower than what's produced in your body. So when my glucose levels go up in my body, I can inject insulin, but it takes about anywhere between 3 to 4 times slower for the exogenous insulin to even reach bloodstream versus it can go into the bloodstream within seconds to minutes. So that's why carbohydrates is so hard to manage and frankly are unreliably able to be managed in the context of type 1 diabetes. But you can really well, let me back up for a second because I think I've lost your question here, Tom.
Manipulating insulin as a type of
yeah. So I mean, you can try these things. What I found is that yes, there is something to be said about having insulin exposure post workout and what it can do for subsequent bouts of exercise the following days. That definitely seems to matter for me. But I also exercise every single day, so maybe it's only unique to me because I am so frequent in exercising. So the acute window is maybe a little bit more important. But in general, I think most of the literature highlights that that a lot of that's kind of washed out, right? Like over the 24-hour window, if you get sufficient amount of calories and nutrients, and you habituate to a diet that's sufficient in essential nutrients, that everything else kind of washes out for the most part. And so, and when you talk about things like exercise, the most important stimulus is the exercise itself. The nutrient and subsequent response around that is actually incredibly less important. So you can see this in a number of studies, actually in and outside of type 1 diabetes, where you can appreciate the stimulus of exercise and like attenuating breakdown of muscle and caloric restriction is so much more important than nutrients itself. I mean, once you start exercising the effect of protein, it can support it, but it's actually infinitely less important than the stimulus itself. So the short answer is I do think it matters. I think it's maybe much more important for the people who are focused on high, world-class level athletics or elite athletics, where they really need to pay attention to these things to get that 1% to 2% benefit. And in the context of type 1 diabetes, you're actually shuttling it to peripheral tissues, particularly muscle. So there is something to be considered there, like powerful potential effects to leverage if you know what you're doing. But for the most part, for the average person, it's more about the totality of the entire day and the overall effect of it. And a great example of that is, I think what you're kind of getting at here is, can you have insulin spikes at particular times of day, and can that lead to, augmentation of performance outcomes or subsequent outcomes with exercise? And I think what we often appreciate is that, looking at circadian literature around exercise, it seems like number one, the hierarchy is exercise first. It doesn't matter when you do it, just do it. The more you do it, no matter when you do it, the better it tends to be for you, especially over time. Yep. Then there might be something to be said about, time of day. And that really more so revolves around insulin sensitivity, where your degree of insulin sensitivity post, let's say, resistance exercise at night might be more powerful than if you did it in the morning. Yeah. And so, yes, you can learn a lot, because I've seen that for years before any literature came out around the circadian biology of insulin sensitivity. For years, people with type 1 diabetes have noticed that the time of day of exercise has profound impacts on their subsequent insulin sensitivity. If I were to wake up and go do sprint intervals or resistant exercise at super high intensities, it's not the same insulin sensitizing effect that I have noticed, or at least a profound glucose lowering effect, than I would see at night. It definitely, even independent of food and nutrients and other factors. And there might be a lot of reasons to that beyond circadian biology. We know that having a meal, it's called a meal effect or insulin meal effect, where just having a meal, the subsequent meal, you're more sensitive to that meal. And it's not necessarily the lingering insulin that's still present. There seems to be independent factors related to some priming effect of the initial meal with insulin that may prime you for higher levels of sensitivity in the subsequent meal. And obviously, by the end of the day, most people have consumed maybe more than one meal. So there's all these variables that may interplay with why someone might be more sensitive or less sensitive at time of days. But you see this in people with type 1 diabetes all the time. This is why people with insulin pumps actually have different levels of insulin, what they call basal insulin. So the baseline levels of insulin can actually flux at certain times of day. There's more insulin administered at night, often for people with type 1 diabetes, because of insulin resistance that occurs. A normal level of insulin, reduced insulin sensitivity, I'm going to put it that way, because people hear insulin resistance, they freak out. Yeah. But actually, relative sensitivity and resistance is just a relative term. Yeah. Okay, it doesn't mean that you have type 2 diabetes now. It just means that you're relatively less sensitive to insulin, and that's normal. I.e., we talked about growth hormone. Higher levels of growth hormone can cause insensitivity. That is normal. Yeah. Not a problem. You don't want to do everything to eviscerate growth hormone just because it causes insulin insensitivity. These are all balancing acts within biology to maximize health outcomes, or in the context of performance, leverage these things to maximize your performance and recovery. So they all can be done, and there's a lot to be learned from what can happen in type 1 diabetes. The prime example that I see that can be learned from type 1 diabetes is just the amount of things that actually changes insulin sensitivity. Sunlight, exercise, walking, physical activity. If I get X amount of steps per day, the insulin sensitizing effect, the total amount of insulin I administer goes down substantially. There's the type of exercise I do. All these things lend itself to unique insights into what has been described in type 1 diabetes of well over 40 factors, lifestyle factors that actually can change insulin sensitivity and the response of the amount of insulin having on blood glucose levels. And so quite a lot has been learned from the lived experience of just administering insulin, before you shower or before heat exposure, when due to sunlight or lack of sunlight, during sickness. Pregnancy is another example where you see high levels of insulin resistance during certain times of trimesters of pregnancy. You learn a lot from that. And it was from people with type 1 diabetes who were becoming pregnant where you learned a lot of this stuff. And so yeah, you can actually, if people are interested to learn more about the effects of just pure effects of insulin or pure effects of high or low glucose levels, you can actually go back to the historical literature on type 1 diabetes and learn quite a lot. Or go ask your friend, like, hey, I'm wondering if sunlight affects my glucose levels, or I'm wondering if time of day affects glucose levels. Go ask your friend, who has type 1 diabetes and say, hey, what happens with you? Because there might not be literature on it yet, but you can go talk to someone with lived experience who is seeing their actual 24/7 glucose levels on a regular basis and get some insights from that. It's certainly, I will say as a researcher, the most powerful thing that I've ever had to understanding metabolism was my lived experience with type 1 diabetes. It was only the knowledge and experience from traditional academic classes and knowledge that came from that gave me understanding to what I actually experienced with my metabolism with type 1 diabetes around insulin and glucose. And that then drove me to be so passionate about trying to leverage those to improve the health of patients with type 1 diabetes. And ultimately, having worked with a number of individuals who both have diabetes, but also are often elite athletes as well, what can be learned to optimize not just health, but also performance? Because there's a lot of things that can be leveraged if you know what you're doing.
And never disregard anecdote. I feel like, it's maybe to a certain degree you can disregard certain anecdote, but the reality is like your lived experience, someone that obviously has a lived experience where you're getting every single nook and cranny of data that you could possibly get. Yeah. That's a true lived experience. Really quickly, we don't have to do a deep dive on it, but have you noticed the effect of sunlight, even if you're like not active in the sunlight? Like if you just go and lay out in the sun for 30 minutes or 60 minutes, absent of maybe heat exposure with it, do you notice a change?
I have, but it's subtle. Mm-hmm. So this is giving personal. This isn't like a randomized control with 1,000 people. This is my lived experience. I have found that sunlight has a pretty important effect on overall insulin sensitivity, and I've actually kind of controlled this and looked at days where I was inside more or went outside first thing in the morning, and have seen changes in insulin sensitivity within those days. I will also say that it's almost impossible to detangle whether that is a result of the benefits of what a lot of people now look at as this setting of your circadian clock and then getting improvements of sleep over time and all these other variables. But I have seen that sunlight does have an effect, although it's incredibly subtle, independent of heat. Heat has a very powerful effect. Yeah. Anyone who has type 1 diabetes who's injected insulin and went into a very hot shower, a very hot bath, or a hot tub, and all of a sudden seen massive tanks in their blood, or sauna, and seen tanks in their blood glucose, post 15 minutes or so, that tells you something.
Just the stress response alone, but probably also the vasodilation, I'd imagine too.
I think it's much more to do with, so number one, you're injecting it peripherally. So it's also about the uptake into the bloodstream. And so the vasodilation, the increased blood flow, all these factors do play a role in the ability for insulin to be exposed to tissues. And the heat expedites that, right? You're moving insulin to these tissues much quicker when you're applying heat or increasing the blood to these peripheral tissues where insulin could be exposed, like muscle tissue or otherwise.
Because there's evidence, at least with like the 660 kind of nanometer wavelength, that has like the red light kind of thing has an impact on glucose levels to a certain degree, but mainly just mitochondrial health. And I know it's not the most robust science, but I'm curious if you've kind of messed with that, because there's a lot of at least early evidence to at least sort of allude to red light being good for the metabolism. I'm just curious if you've noticed anything on that.
If any company wants to send me a red light thing, I'll try it. Send me one. But no, I haven't tried the red light therapy. I don't know. I definitely have seen the data around some of the positive benefits of red light therapy. I haven't tried it myself, so I can't actually speak to it. I can say that actual sunlight itself, especially getting a sufficient amount each day, that could be vitamin D. It could be setting your circadian clock. It could be a number of different factors that plays a role. But it definitely seems to matter and this is actually looking at insulin load. So actually seeing the total amount of insulin that is released from these devices, because it's tracked 24/7. You can actually see the total amount released. And so I've noticed a difference, but most people would never actually know, unless they have that ability to track 24/7.
I'd be curious if, like sunlight is just relaxing you, changing things. Who knows? But that would probably have the opposite effect. It's like if you took someone that was hyper stressed and put them in the sun compared to someone that was like laying out on a beach, super happy, right? Like, wonder what the difference would be. It's anyway, man. Where can everyone find you?
So they can go to andrewkoutnik.com. A lot of free resources are available there. I'm on Twitter X at Koutnik, Koutnik. Instagram and TikTok at Andrew Koutnik PhD, YouTube channel, and also a Substack if people are interested. But I house almost all of that just on my website for free for people. So
right on, my man. Thanks, brother.
All right. Thank you, guys.